The title is Black Holes, but that's not meant only in the literal sense of the black holes studied by astrophysics. It also refers to my rather atypical liking for the Ding an sich, the thing in itself, which is despised by most philosophers today for various reasons, and I try to defend it. It's often considered a useless concept. If there's something outside of thought, then how can you talk about it without thinking about it? And we get trapped in a circle. And I will defend that in its own terms, but I also want to say that no one calls black holes useless in the sciences, right? Even though we can't get a direct view of what's going on inside the black hole, we can deduce certain things about it from its effects and from other things we know about black holes in the universe, if they exist. They're just candidates now, none has been definitively found. And I also hold that the same is true of the thing in itself, or what I call the withdrawn object. My background for this is more Heideggerian than Kantian, actually. And also, I always start my lectures from zero. I don't assume any prior knowledge among any of the audience members, so I have this double task of trying to cover all the basics of my ideas without boring too much the people who already know them. But Aristotle said that it's more pleasurable to it's more pleasurable to review truths that are already known than to learn new truths. So the people who are already familiar with my ideas will simply enjoy the first 20 or 30 minutes while I give a compressed account of my ideas. All right. Now, with this topic, I wanted to do two things this summer. Michael Hart pointed out that the EGS is a good location for testing the limits of what you know and don't know. I wanted to show that even science, in the case of black holes, deals with an object, an entity that it cannot give direct propositional discursive knowledge about, as it usually can about other objects that are more accessible. But I also wanted to challenge myself, because I think I'll give my argument tonight again for why I think philosophy is closer to the arts than to the natural sciences. But I also don't want to give short shrift to the natural sciences. I'm conscious that my view of science is probably still too indebted to Heidegger, and it's thus still a little too negative towards the normal kind of science. And so I want to rethink how you can incorporate the concept of scientific knowledge into philosophy without just picking up theories here and there and incorporating them piecemeal into your philosophy, and also without turning into the handmaid of the sciences, which I think some of the speculative realists have begun to do. Some of the speculative realists and their followers have become kind of hardcore scientific naturalists, scientism we call it. And that's the first time that's happened in the Continental tradition of philosophy, which has generally been more suspicious of the claims of science. And I think now there's a reaction and it's going in the opposite direction. All right, now realism. Realism is generally unfashionable in philosophy, at least in the Continental tradition. And that's right, not everyone is going to know the difference between Analytic and Continental philosophy, which is actually going to be part of my theme tonight. Analytic philosophy is generally associated with Anglo-American universities. It tends to follow the paradigm of the natural sciences in the sense of people writing short, focused journal articles, working on narrowly concentrated research projects, referring to their contemporaries, referring to things that have been written in the last few years, not caring too much about the history of philosophy, but trying to make progress along a relatively narrowly defined front of contemporary research projects. And the Continental tradition, so-called not because all of its members are from the continent, or that all people from the continent are continental philosophers, but because it's largely a Franco-German tradition. And I would say all the philosophers who have ever come through the walls of the EGS probably fit into the Continental tradition, and I suspect it will remain that way for some time to come, as long as we have the current leadership, and I shouldn't say it, but I'm fine with that, I guess. And now it's also, idealism is also unfashionable. As realism is unfashionable, you're also not going to find too many people who say, I'm an idealist, nothing exists outside the mind. What's more common is this strategy of saying that's a pseudo-problem. You can't really take a realist or an idealist position. And this is what Meillassoux called, I thought accurately, correlationism. This is the term that galvanized the gathering of four people with different philosophical projects. We all were tired of this notion that you try to get beyond the realism-idealism disputes. Why did that dispute fall out of fashion? Well, in Continental tradition, it's because of phenomenology, I would say. Husserl and Heidegger were both adamant in saying that the realism question, whether the real world exists outside of our thought, is a pseudo-problem. Husserl, for example, says, we're always already outside of our mind in thinking objects, intending objects. And so therefore it's a false problem to know whether those objects exist outside the mind or not. Heidegger also ridiculed this question regularly, and it hasn't been a question that has been well received whenever raised in the Continental tradition ever since. So in speculative realism, there is a unified agreement on trying to get past correlationism and try to ask again about the world itself, which is not original in the analytic side. Realism has always been a real option there. However, there are some strange features of the realism I am defending. First of all, it's a realism without materialism. Realism and materialism are often mixed. I'm going to make an argument against materialism tonight. It's a realism without knowledge. Realism in philosophy is often associated with the idea that you can also know the real. Scientific realism is the idea there's a real world outside the mind, and there are certain criteria we can follow in our methods that allow us to know the world to some extent. I'm going to say that realism implies the radical unknowability of the world. That's the fact, commitment to realism means a commitment to no direct knowledge. Not because there's nothing out there to know, but because we can't get it. It's too real to be translated into any form of knowledge. And I'm also then going to defend a form of essentialism, which is also unpopular because it's seen as oppressive and patriarchal and these sorts of things. However, I'm going to argue that the problem with essentialism is not the notion that things have essence, but the notion that the essence can be known and therefore used to govern people. I've just written a few years ago, but it's just coming out now, a fairly critical essay on Edward Said, who of course is a hero in Egypt for political reasons. I have some criticisms to make of his concept of Orientalism, the simplest of which is that at times he seems to border on claiming that you can't really say there's an essence to the Arab world or an essence to Egypt or an essence to something or other. On the other hand, what that leaves you with is the opposite problem, the Margaret Thatcher problem of saying that society does not exist. There are only individuals and you can't generalize, you can't stereotype. Well, you shouldn't stereotype. You should know that each person is different. At the same time, there are cultural rules that you're a fool not to learn if you move from one place to another. When I moved from the United States to Egypt 14 years ago, I tried my best to figure out what those different cultural topics are that you have to tiptoe around, and I continue to learn them to this day. But I don't see that there's anything essentially oppressive politically in the concept of essence. The oppression comes if you're sitting in the British colonial office and you're saying the Arabs are inherently undemocratic and therefore we need to govern them in this way or that way. It's a knowledge claim about the essence. For me, of course, the essence is never knowable because nothing's ever directly knowable, and so therefore some caution is needed in approaching these essences. They cannot be used for political governance purposes, so I don't see any danger in that. And I'm also going to call for a realism of objects. Some realists do not like the notion of objects. Some people claim that objects are the folk product of our naive manifest image, that they're simply the product of a folk psychology, and that since we live in a world that seems to have solid objects, we project that onto philosophy, but they're not really there. James Ladyman and Don Ross, for example. I've talked about them in my class and criticized them pretty severely in an article called I Am Also of the Opinion That Materialism Must Be Destroyed. And I do think it must be destroyed. I think materialism is bad, and I'm going to tell you why right now. I wrote a piece for Documenta, the art show, a couple of years ago. It's called The Third Table. A lot of artists have read this. And the third table was my engagement with Sir Arthur Stanley Eddington, who had the famous metaphor of the two tables. Eddington was a British physicist, best known for his observations of an eclipse that lent credence to Einstein's general theory of relativity. Eddington was able to determine during an eclipse that the position of the star, relative position of the stars, is different when they're close to the sun because the gravity is bending the starlight. And Newton's theory would not have predicted this degree of bending. That's what he's most famous for. He's also famous, though, for giving the Gifford Lectures in Scotland, also for being an anti-war activist for World War I, but especially for giving these Gifford Lectures in Edinburgh, in which he began with the famous metaphor of the two tables. And philosophers used to refer to this all the time. It's fallen out of fashion. Eddington says, I'm sitting here preparing my lectures at this table, but it's actually two tables. There's the everyday table, which is solid, and I put things on it, and it has a certain price and a position in the room, and I can move it around. That's the first table. But as a physicist, I also know there's a second table, which is mostly particles swirling around. It's mostly empty space. The particles are only one of many billionths of the part of the table itself. And Eddington says that table is the more real table. He won't be able to get rid of our everyday table in our minds, but actually the scientific table is the real table. So the practical table isn't really there. There are different interpretations of this. Ladyman and Ross say that only the practical table exists and not the scientific table, because they think science teaches us that at the bottom of the world is simply a mathematical structure, and all these objects we see are not really there. They're just patterns that meet the human minds. Roy Bhaskar, a realist philosopher of science, says both are real, because he believes in emergence. He believes that there's the scientific table, you study the electrons and the other particles at the bottom, and there's also the practical table, because you can't reduce that practical table to its subatomic particles. I, however, say that neither of those tables is real. The real table is what I call the third table. It's in between the two tables, and I argued in that Documenta essay that the arts are already onto this third table, and philosophy is onto this third table, and that therefore we've been trying to mimic either the sciences or deductive geometry in philosophy for the last 400 years. We should actually be taking the arts as a model, and that the arts are about indirect access to objects. The sciences are more about paraphrasing objects in terms of their qualities. The arts are under professional pressure not to do this and to do something else that I'll talk about. So I will say something a little now about the history of philosophy. For the most part, the history of philosophy has been unkind to objects. The history of philosophy and of science in the West has mostly been trying to get rid of objects, the pitcher, the cup, the human body, the microphone. They've tried to get rid of it in one of two basic ways. There are lots of permutations, but there are two basic ways. You can get rid of an object by saying we need to go deeper and look at the particles it's made of, the stuff that it's made of. And this is what the Pre-Socratics did at the dawn of Western philosophy. You had one group of pre-Socratic philosophers saying that either the first principle of everything is water, or it's air, earth, fire, and water, joined by love, separated by hate, or it's atoms in the case of Democritus, the only one we still take seriously. This is one group of pre-Socratics. They say that forget all these mid-sized objects. What's really there, what's really eternal, what makes up everything is some privileged physical element. And they simply argued about which one it was. There's another school of the pre-Socratic philosophers who were defending what's called the apeiron, the boundless, the limitless, the indefinite. Think of it as an inarticulate lump or blob-like thing, and because this is more general than all those other specific things. Air is too specific to be the root of everything. Water is too specific. How could you make a fire out of water, for example? This was the sort of objection they made. Instead, there's this giant indeterminate lump, this apeiron, that everything emerges from and passes into. And the argument among those philosophers was simply when this thing existed. Did it exist in the past before it was destroyed? Does it exist now and our senses deceive us into thinking otherwise, as Parmenides would say, though he called it being and not the apeiron? Or will it exist in the future, once all opposites cancel each other? Anaximander, the first theorist of the apeiron. And also the inspiration from Marx, perhaps, since Marx did his doctoral dissertation on these early Greek thinkers. And you could see the gradual erosion of government as being a kind of apeiron to come in the future. That's one kind of way of getting rid of objects. You can say objects are too shallow to be the truth. There's something deeper. It's this physical element, or it's this deeper indeterminate thing that everything emerges from. I call this undermining, the undermining of objects, normal English words. You're undermining an object whenever you say that it's too shallow, you need to go to something deeper. And we still see this today, of course, in a lot of straightforward scientific materialism, and a lot of neurophilosophy that says there aren't really emotions and moods. There's simply neural activation patterns and things of this sort. So it still has a lot of prestige in both in the natural sciences and in philosophies inspired by the natural sciences. Get rid of everything. It's a nihilistic move. You're getting rid of stuff and finding something more basic. What's the problem with this? The problem with this is that it cannot really explain what we call emergence. It cannot really explain why water, H2O, has properties not found in hydrogen or oxygen. A lot of philosophers have talked about that. It cannot explain, one of Delanda's examples, that a thing is not totally dependent on all of its pieces. You're losing cells from your body constantly. I think every 7 years or so, all of your cells are replaced. You wouldn't call it a different body just for that reason. You would not call your body simply an aggregate of all the cells, because they're changing, it doesn't matter. A city or a society, people are constantly dying, moving in, moving out, being born. You would not necessarily call it a different society. You would not say that we're using Switzerland simply as a nickname for a changing aggregate. No, there's something about Switzerland because it shapes the actions of the people in it, and it has a certain unified front that it presents to people from outside. You could not say that Switzerland is simply an aggregate of a bunch of parts. There may be cases where you do say that. If somebody says, the army of all the people in the world named John, that's a fairly arbitrary assemblage, and you could say it's not really a thing. That's just I'm designating something that doesn't really exist. So that's undermining. And I had to coin a term for the opposite move. And so I called it overmining. This is the more modern move. And my French translator had a heck of a time with this because English is one of the few languages where you can do this, undermining, overmining, with the prefix. And this is the idea not that objects are too shallow, but that objects are too deep. Why do you naively posit these real objects behind language or behind power or behind the event or behind networks of signification or behind actions? Bruno Latour, probably my favorite living philosopher, says a thing is its actions. A thing is whatever it transforms, modifies, perturbs, or creates. I'm simply what I'm doing right now. I'm simply how I affect all of you. Whitehead is simply, the actual entity is simply what it's prehending. You cannot, if you try to posit a thing existing outside its relations, Whitehead calls it a vacuous actuality. There's no reason to talk about it. It's vacuous. Berkeley is an obvious example. To be is to be perceived. There's nothing hiding behind the perception. So the overmining philosophies are all those that say that there's an object is superfluous. You don't even need to destroy it because it doesn't exist. It's a naive superstition. All that we really have access to are bundles of qualities or events or constant flux that we're arbitrarily carving into objects. What's the problem with this? The problem with this, as Aristotle saw a long time ago, is that it cannot explain change. If something is only what it's doing right now, it can never become something else. The example he was talking about in the Metaphysics is that the Megarians, who were his serious rivals then from Megara near Athens, the Megarians said, you're not a house builder unless you're building a house right now. And Aristotle said this is absurd because what about a master house builder who's sleeping? What about someone who has natural talents to build houses and simply hasn't completed their schooling yet? There has to be an unexpressed reality, in other words, a reality that's there now that is simply not expressing itself in the actual anywhere. And he calls that potentiality, which I reject for other reasons, but it's an important insight that a thing has to be more than what it's doing right now. It also, not everything that it is currently expressing itself in relation with other things. And you have these two together, and they usually team up to destroy objects. They get it from both directions. People realize they need both of these to get rid of objects. An example of this will be scientific materialism. Scientific materialism says, really things can be reduced to their ultimate parts. It's an undermining move. There's these tiny things that everything can be explained by. But when you get there, what do you find? Do you find some mysterious thing that's beneath our comprehension? No, you find something mathematizable, which is a form of overmining. It's completely comprehensible in mathematical terms. There's no mysterious excess to the lowest physical layer, according to these people. And so what you get is you get this bottom layer of somehow physical stuff, and then you get this upper layer of knowable mathematizable stuff. What loses out is the objects in between. You're getting rid of both. You're keeping those and getting rid of the one in the middle. You're getting rid of the mezzanine level of the world's objects, which can be of any size. Bruno Latour does this from the opposite side. Bruno Latour, he starts off as an overminer. He starts off saying there are no objects, there are no substances hidden behind their actions. Things are their actions. You follow the actors. That's his method. Look at what things are doing. Don't hypothesize things that exist behind their actions. Things are their actions. But then he starts realizing in the early 21st century that he can't really explain change either, even though he wants to give us a philosophy of transformations. He realizes that if a thing is nothing more than its effects, that it's always going to have the same effects. It's not going to have new effects in the future. So he comes up with this new concept, the plasma, which he drops after a few years. But for a while he tries this. The plasma is basically the pre-Socratic operon. It's this indeterminate mass from which all change emerges. All kinds of different change. He says, why did the Soviet Union collapse overnight without warning? The plasma. Because the Soviet Union was formatted in a certain way, it didn't seem vulnerable to most of us, but then the plasma decided to erupt. No word as to why the Soviet Union collapsed as opposed to some other empire, right? It wasn't a matter of instability there, instability here, it was simply that the plasma decided to erupt over here. Why do friendships and love affairs collapse without warning? The plasma. And my favorite, why does the most mediocre academic musician suddenly compose a brilliant symphony, which you can tell me if that's ever happened. Not that you know of. Yeah, I don't think so either. It's a great example. The plasma. The plasma somehow inspires the person. And he even says the plasma is the size of London. All the networks of individual things are the size of the underground, the London Underground. So this plasma is vast. Of course, it can't explain the reason for different changes in different places. It's this unified lump that all things share. It causes all kinds of different effects in different places. It doesn't really work, and he's kind of quietly brushed this aside. But it was a reaction to a problem. The name I gave to this, playing it both ways at once, is dual mining. And that's a name that I just came up with in my head because it's mining in two ways. And I Googled it to see if it was an original term. It's not, but it's great the way in which it's not. It comes from the credit card industry. Dual mining means data mining and text mining people at the same time to find out as much about them as you can. So it's got this great sinister sense of exploitation. And I contend that philosophy is about the avoidance of dual mining, and I don't think that's a new idea. I think that's what Socrates already meant. Socrates does not think philosophy is a knowledge. Socrates never gives us a knowledge of virtue, a knowledge of justice, a knowledge of friendship. Socrates undercuts all definitions. Socrates says you have to know what a thing is before you know what properties it has, which sounds paradoxical. We usually define a thing by its properties. But he's saying, no, there's something a little deeper there. A thing is something other than its properties. You have to know it. You cannot know it. It's not really knowable. Actually, it's knowable. But it's knowable obliquely. It's knowable indirectly. It is not knowable directly. You cannot paraphrase anything. You cannot paraphrase an object. This term comes from literary criticism. It's been known for a long time. You cannot paraphrase a metaphor. You cannot replace a metaphor with a literal sentence that tells you exactly what the metaphor means. The literal statements always underdetermine the metaphor. The metaphor is always capable of being explicated in other ways. The metaphor is more than any paraphrase. I would say that an object is more than any of its paraphrases. And I would say that the arts know this. This is what I was getting at in the third table essay. The sciences are under pressure to paraphrase. The sciences are under pressure to replace a proper name, like electron, with true properties that belong to the electron. You're doing good science when you unpack the word and give a list of true qualities that can be verified, that belong to the thing. In the arts, that's a very bad move, right? In the arts, you're not undermining or overmining the artwork. You're probably not creating a sculpture and calling it 75% marble, 22% black paint. And you could, as a kind of deliberate stunt, but that's not the normal case in the arts. You're not going to the artwork to observe the artwork wondering what its chemical composition is, probably, unless that's your line of work. You're also not going to say that the artwork is just however I interpret it. That's a very lazy relativist way of interpreting artworks. The artwork is challenging you. The artwork is challenging your first interpretation. The better the artwork, usually the more different times you can come to it and interpret it in different ways. So the artwork is something deeper than its possible interpretations, deeper than its effects, and also whatever the opposite of deeper is, shallower than its chemical components. It's something that cannot be reduced in either direction. It cannot be reduced downward or reduced upward. And my claim was in the third table was simply that philosophy is a lot closer to the arts, actually, in this sense. Because philosophy also does not provide knowledge. Philosophy and the arts have cognitive value, but it's not a kind of knowledge. The sciences have to give us knowledge. That's what they're born to do. Now, I'll get back to that in a second. But I don't want to make it sound like all philosophers have been ganging up on objects, a concept I like, because there have been at least 4 contrary trends, at least 4 schools in the history of philosophy in the West that have embraced objects to a certain extent, but I don't think completely enough. The first of those is, of course, Aristotle's tradition. Aristotle is incredibly unfashionable right now. When I started in graduate school, it was Plato. You had to overturn Plato or reverse Plato, or I'm not a Platonist. Everybody had to prove they weren't a Platonist. And then somehow Plato was rehabilitated along the way. I don't know when it happened. Plato's cool again. Aristotle is not cool right now. Aristotle's kind of the boring middle-aged classifier. And along with him, the other boring one now is Husserl, another philosopher I like. Those are the 2 boring ones that no one wants to work on for various reasons. They'll come back too. They're of sufficient magnitude that they will come back in a new form. Aristotle, of course, who's the first to say that individual things are the primary substances, rather than ideas, rather than some privileged elements like air or water or atoms, individual things. What's the problem there? The problem there is he is too focused on natural objects. Aristotle does not have much respect for machines or armies or nations as being substances. These are the things we often want to talk about most now. Airplanes, the European Union, we need to be able to talk about these things now. And there's no reason not to call them objects. Objects don't mean physical, durable, unified things that can be moved around in space. Object simply means for me something that cannot be reduced in either direction, something that cannot be decomposed without loss into pieces and cannot be interpreted solely in terms of its effects. Something that reduces both of those movements is an object. We can't always know exactly whether it's an object or not. Is grunge music a real object or not? Or is it really just a kind of loose nickname for several different styles that are confused? I don't know. I don't know the field well enough. But we're never going to know exactly, in some cases, whether the thing's a real object or not. That doesn't really matter. We're not looking for certitude. We're looking for realism. And realism does not go hand in hand with absolute knowledge, which is why I regret the recent trend towards absolute knowledge. Badiou, Zizek, Measu. I think we need to keep the finitude for reasons I will explain. So the school of Aristotle and Leibniz, they're not good at dealing with compound things. They're not good at dealing with artificial things. They're good at dealing with natural things and simple things, for the most part. Kant, of course. Kant, who talks of a thing in itself beyond our access to it. Okay, fair enough. I'm somewhat sympathetic to the thing in itself, more so than most people. But the problem with Kant's thing in itself is that all it does is haunt humans. Poor finite humans can't reach the in itself. He doesn't project this into the relations between things. He confuses this with human psychological peculiarities. The fact that humans have language, humans have perception, humans have cognition, and therefore we're finite. No, that's not why we're finite. We're finite because any relation between any two things does not exhaust the relata. Any relation between any two things. The famous example from Islamic philosophy, fire and cotton. When the fire burns the cotton, the fire does not interact with all the properties of the cotton. It interacts only with those limited ones that the fire needs in order to combust the cotton, to burn the cotton. So the usual way of overturning Kant in the history of philosophy, and it continues now, is to say Kant was a genius except for this thing in itself nonsense, right? That's a residue of the past because if you think about the thing in itself, you're already thinking about it, and therefore you're trapped inside the circle, so there can't be a thing in itself. So the difference between noumena and phenomena is internal to the phenomena, and you get Hegel, you get Zizek, you get Mersenne in different ways. I think that's a mistake. I think that was not the right way to reverse Kant. The right way to reverse Kant was to say Kant was a genius precisely because of the thing in itself. He was simply wrong to restrict it to a human problem. Poor, tragic humans were so finite. No, it's any relation that brings this out. Any relation is going to fail to exhaust the relata. There's going to be something that withdraws from the relation. It's a kind of a Heideggerian thing, but it's a Heideggerian thing in which it's not just Dasein and the world, it's any two objects interacting. It's globalizing the Kantian or Heideggerian problem. And so this gives it a cosmological dimension that you don't find in these philosophers. Okay, that's the second place you can find a certain defense of objects. The third would be Whitehead, and followed by Bruno Latour, Stengers, and some others. Whitehead, of course, is very sympathetic to individual objects. He uses the term actual entities, which includes God, it includes puffs of smoke, it includes anything's an actual entity. But the problem with that school, as I see it, is it dissolves the object into a set of relations. The object is nothing more than what it does. And again, I've tried to argue that this cannot work because you cannot explain, if you don't allow, there's some unexpressed surplus in the thing, you cannot explain how it has different effects over time. And so that's the problem with that. Now the fourth, which is usually not recognized, phenomenology. I would call phenomenology the greatest object-oriented school of all time in Western philosophy. And I'm waving the phenomenological banner, even though it's somewhat out of fashion these days. It just needs to be reinterpreted, I think. Why is it the greatest object-oriented school? Well, we have to move in a couple of steps here. First, you have to look at Husserl. Husserl is definitely an idealist. I don't like the people who defend Husserl by saying, no, he really believes in a real world because you're always outside your mind intending objects. No, because not all those objects are real. You can intend a battle of centaurs in the logical investigations. Intending a battle of centaurs does not mean there's really a battle of centaurs going on. It means you're imagining it, you're rotating it in your mind, looking at the centaurs from different angles. So Husserl is an idealist, and for this reason I accept Heidegger's critique. What is Heidegger's critique? Heidegger's critique is that Husserl tries to turn the world into presence in consciousness. Right? Things are primarily presence in consciousness. Do not begin with scientific theories about the real world outside the mind. Describe exactly what a door slamming sounds like to you and all its subtleties and all its psychological overtones. Don't start with the theory of sound waves going through the air and vibrating your eardrum, because that doesn't come first. That's mediated. What comes first is your very sensitive literary experience, perhaps, of hearing the door slam. And you can describe this in wonderful detail, as some phenomenologists do. Heidegger's point, of course, is that for the most part, things are not present to us. Things are not there. They're taken for granted. Things are absent. I hope you're not going to gong, like the Gong Show. He stood up next to the gong. This is Heidegger's tool analysis. Heidegger's tool analysis tells us that things are primarily taken for granted. You weren't thinking about the floor until I mentioned it just now, but you needed it. If you hadn't had the floor, you would have fallen into whatever, cellar or hell or something, been badly injured or killed. Now, I don't think Heidegger's tool analysis is usually read deeply enough. I wrote a whole book about this. Usually what people say is Heidegger shows us that before theory comes praxis. There's this practical background that we're using stuff before we think about it, before we see it. And Rorty picks this up and says, see, Heidegger's just regurgitating Dewey because Dewey knew this 30 years earlier. Heidegger's just Dewey plus a bunch of historical writings. He's not really adding anything to Dewey. The problem is that's not what he's saying. Why? Because when you use something, you're not making any more direct contact with it than when you're looking at it or than when you're theorizing about it. If you make a theory about trees, you're a botanist. Okay, obviously you're not exhausting all the features of the tree. The tree is a surplus. The tree is overly objectified by your theory. There's always untheorized remnants to that tree. But if you use a tree for shade, or for chopping it down in firewoods, or for just looking at it and admiring it, in all of these cases you are also not getting to the depths of the tree. You are getting some surface configurations of the tree. There's a surplus there, otherwise it wouldn't be able to change. There's a tree as object that is not exhaustible by the tree as a relation. And so praxis is no better than theory. It's no better than perception at exhausting the things. There's a deeper problem there. So in a way, you could expand or push Heidegger's theory a bit to say that it's about objects hiding from any relation to humans, not just about praxis as being deeper than theory. Praxis is on the same level as theory. Both are superficial oversimplifications of the things. But you also have to push that a step further and say inanimate objects do this to each other. And this is the part of my work that people say is crazy at first, but it's really not. It follows pretty simply from the arguments if you look at it. That it's all about the interaction between any two objects whatsoever. This seems strange because philosophy has gotten used to not talking about the inanimate world anymore. We've accepted a division of labor in continental philosophy where the scientists can talk about combustion and trees and all these things because they do that very well. And we're going to talk about human stuff, right? Because they don't do that. What's the problem with that? The problem with that is they're not even giving us the human stuff anymore. People like Metzinger are coming along and saying that neuroscience is going to take over philosophy and replace it. But don't worry, we still need you for ethics panels, he says. Philosophers will always be needed for ethics panels. Well, that's what we get. That's what we deserve for letting them have the whole inanimate world to themselves and not saying anything about it. We should go back in, not because we're going to tell the sciences what to do, but because we're going to be dealing with nature in a different way. We're going to be dealing with objects not as measurable sets of qualities, but as something that cannot quite be approached. All right, so that's Heidegger. And I would say this is where Heidegger's objects come from. Now, Heidegger doesn't really have objects. Why not? Because Heidegger tends to see that subterranean realm as being unified. He tends to see being not only as being withdrawn from presence, but also as being one, as opposed to the many of beings. There are places where he veers away from that. Some of the stuff in the fourfold, he veers away from that. But for the most part, Heidegger is very much like Badiou, I'm afraid, inclined to think of the pre-Kant world as being one. And Badiou denies it's one by calling it the inconsistent multiple, but it's not multiple, right? It's simply this indeterminate thing that he calls multiple, and it's not. There's no multiplicity for him until the count happens. So I wish you were here so we could argue this, but I think that's the wrong move in Badiou's philosophy, is distinguishing between the inconsistent and the consistent multiple. But more about that some other time. I want to go back and save Husserl from this condemnation of being an idealist, which he is. What is really valuable about Husserl, I would say, it's usually not recognized even by his admirers. His admirers are always quick to tell us he's not really an idealist because we're always already outside of our minds. No. What's really important about Husserl is his refutation of Hume, which has gone unnoticed. How does he refute Hume? Well, Hume is an anti-object philosopher because he thinks there are no objects, they're bundles of qualities. We see bundles of qualities going consistently together. We give the nickname apple to certain qualities that seem to go together a lot, over and over and over again, customary conjunction through habits. It's not really an object, that's just a convenient name we give to it. It's really just a set of visible qualities. Husserl and Phenomenology, if they do anything right, it's that they completely overturn this and reverse it. What comes first for Phenomenology? It's the object. You don't first see a bunch of sense data and then constitute the object out of it. You see an object showing different qualities at different times. You see your friend Hans walking down the street. It's an actual example in Husserl. Your friend Hans is walking down the street. You don't say, this humanoid figure, it looks 98% similar to the person yesterday I called my friend Hans, and therefore, for all practical purposes, it's Hans. No, you say it's Hans again. Why does he look sad today? He looked happy yesterday. Why is he wearing a red shirt today? Well, he changed his shirt. Okay, so when you see black, it's not the same black if it's the black of an ink or the black of an executioner's hood. I think it's Merleau-Ponty who said that. The color is somehow enslaved to the object. It's the object that is giving a certain feel to the color. The color is not scientifically defined as the same by scientific measurements that are found to be accurate. The object comes first, and the object inflects the qualities or bends them so that the qualities are somehow slaves of the object. And what is phenomenology about? It's about analyzing any object, stripping away the accidental properties and trying to find the essential properties, which means there's a tension for Husserl between objects and their qualities that you never find in Hume. You never even find it in Brentano. You don't find it any time before Husserl that I can see. That is really his signal contribution to philosophy, I would say. This tension within the realm of experience, objects within the realm of experience that are not reducible to bundles of sense data. Okay, so there are two kinds of objects in phenomenology. There's Heidegger's, which are deep, they're withdrawn, they can never become present in any way. Then there are Husserl's objects, which are always present. They simply are encrusted with too many extra qualities. You have to get rid of those accidental qualities and get at the essence, which he thinks you can do. I don't think you can ever do it. I don't think you can ever actually reach intuitively the essence of Spain or the essence of an apple. There's going to be some approximations there. All right, so there are two implications of this. I'm moving slowly towards black holes here. Objects are black holes. One of them is that objects are unknowable directly. That's one of the implications. If objects are withdrawn from any relation, they're certainly withdrawn from knowledge. We're never going to be able to get a direct cognitive paraphrase of what the object is. That's incorrect. And this is why I oppose the turn towards the absolute that you see in Badiou, especially in Meillassoux. The idea in Meillassoux that you can get the primary qualities of a thing by mathematizing it. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with that is he cannot explain the difference between a mathematical model of a thing and a thing itself. Ultimately, if you follow his logic, a perfect mathematical model of a tree would itself be a tree, because you're mathematizing, that should be the real tree. And he'll say that's a straw man, right? He's never really claiming that. Well, of course he's not claiming it, because no one does a reductio ad absurdum proof on themselves. I'm the one who's saying that that's what this leads to. That's what this leads to. It leads to the consequence that he cannot tell us the difference between those two. So what he ends up with is saying something like, the real tree is inhering in dead matter, whereas the model of the tree is not. Okay, but now you're back to Thomas Aquinas, right? The form stamped in matter. And I think Suarez did a good job against that already. So we don't want to go back to that kind of metaphysics. I think you need an actual difference in the form of a mathematical tree and of the real tree. But the other even more strange implication is that objects cannot touch directly. And that's why I've talked about vicarious causation, which is a form of occasionalism. And I want to defend that briefly. The history of occasionalism. It started in Islam for theological reasons. It comes from a passage in the Quran about the Battle of Badr, which was a major upset victory by the Muslims over the infidels, outnumbered, and they still won anyway. And there's a passage in the Quran, which I cannot remember word for word, but it says something like, you think you threw the stone, but in fact it was Allah who threw the stone. God threw the stone for you and slew the enemy. Now, the usual way of interpreting that is this battle was a miracle. This battle was a miracle of divine intervention that saved the Muslims from certain defeats. But there's another way some people read it, which is as all causal interaction is caused directly by God. There is no causal interaction between things that is not by God. And these were the reactionary theologians, not the liberal ones who liked Avicenna and Averroes and Al-Farabi, who all liked the Greek philosophers. These were the more reactionary people who said things like, God can send a good person to hell for no reason whatsoever, and we cannot question this. But I would say this is an incredibly important contribution to Western philosophy for a reason I'm going to say here. This did not catch on in Europe until the 17th century in a Cartesian context. Why did it not catch on? Probably because the Christian Middle Ages in Europe were pretty nervous about the problem of free will and the idea, if you think God is stabbing somebody for you, how can you actually be sent to hell for this? Made people nervous, and so it didn't really catch on until Descartes had the two different kinds of substances, res extensa, res cogitans. How can a mind affect a body? How can I move my arm? These are two totally different kinds of substances. And the solution is that God does it. Interestingly, God does not have to come in nature and make things collide, because nature tends to be interpreted by Descartes as one giant body, which means he can get religion out of science completely. God only comes in the interaction between the two substances. Malebranche complicated this a bit afterwards and brought back the Arab concept that even body-body interactions need God as a mediator. And now you could say that in a sense Spinoza, everything, nature is God. You can say Leibniz, because all the relations are only mediated by God. Berkeley, certainly. It's God who coordinates all the perceptions. There's not really any objects outside the perceptions. So why do we not just laugh at this? If you teach occasionalism to an undergraduate in a Western context, they're going to laugh. My students in Egypt don't laugh, because it's more part of their tradition. But in a Western context, they'll say, oh yeah, those people were naive in that time, thinking that God is picking this up for me. All right, but do we really believe anything different? Is the problem with occasionalism really that it's God's, and people don't believe in God anymore in Western philosophy circles? Or is the problem not that God is given a causal monopoly, and we give that same causal monopoly to the human mind, Hume and Kant? It's simply an upside-down occasionalism, modern philosophy in the West. Causation is granted as a monopoly either to habits, customary conjunction as in Hume, or it's made a category of the understanding as in Kant. It's not really something we can talk about as occurring in the outside world objectively. Now, Whiteheads has enough guts in the 1920s to bring back the God version of occasionalism, right? And says we prehend everything through God using the eternal objects, which I admire his guts in doing that. But I wouldn't say people believe this literally, even when they like Whiteheads. Then you've got Latour, who tries to secularize Whitehead, which is interesting because Latour is very Catholic and probably even more religious than Whitehead's, and yet he doesn't bring God in to solve philosophical problems the way Whitehead does. Latour says, how do two things touch? Two things touch only with a mediator, but it's always a local mediator. It's not always the human mind. It's not always God. It's a local mediator. His example is the French atomic bomb project, which didn't really get very far before they were out of the war. Joliot, Frédéric Joliot, the son-in-law of Vicarious, and a Nobel Prize-winning scientist in his own right, as was his wife and his mother and father-in-law, of course. What links politics and neutrons is Latour's question. Who would think there was any link between politics and neutrons? What could seem less political than a neutron? Neutrons were not discovered until, I think, 1929 by Chadwick. They seem to have no political value whatsoever until they discovered the use of it in atomic fission, and it became Joliot's job to convince the French war ministry, you've got to start investing in this stuff right now. We're going to need this in the war. And France was out before they could do much about it, but he, at least in France, is the one that forms the link between politics and neutrons. What is the problem with this? The problem with this is if politics and neutrons cannot touch, how can Joliot touch politics and how can Joliot touch neutrons? How does he touch neutrons? Okay, through scientific instruments. How does he touch scientific instruments? Through his eyeballs. How does he touch his eyeballs? Through his nervous system. How does he touch his nervous system? Through his brain. And you can keep going like this. It could be an infinite number of mediators. It's like a Zeno's paradox. Nothing ever touches because you can always put a third thing in between any two. Latour's solution, a very disappointing pragmatist solution. You stop when it gets boring. That is a solution. It's interesting to ask about how politics touches neutrons. It's not interesting to ask how Joliot touches his own brain. So therefore, just give it up at a certain point. But that doesn't solve the philosophical problem. That's like refuting Zeno by just walking out the door, instead of proving how you can do it, even though you have to go halfway and then halfway and then halfway. And you have to give a logical refutation of this, and he can't. And my claim is that you only solve it in one way. You need two different kinds of objects, because if you have two real objects, they can't touch. They're going to withdraw from each other. They're not going to be able to make direct contact. And guess what? I've already established two kinds of objects. There are the real objects, there are the sensual objects. So my thesis is just as you can touch magnets in an infinite chain by touching north and south, south and north, north and south, south and north, you can do the same with objects as long as they're different kinds. So causation occurs indirectly. Causation between two real things occurs through an image, which it follows that causation occurs inside a mind. It doesn't need to be a human mind. It can be the experience of some non-human thing. Okay, so that was about occasionalism, but there's also the question about unknowability. This is maybe even more interesting. People say your philosophy doesn't work because it makes knowledge impossible. We can't ever say anything about the real world. All we can do is say there's a thing in itself out there and I can't know anything about it. That's not really true either, because we can also have indirect access to things. And I want to say that that's not new. We already know this. It's not so common in the sciences. It's very common in the humanities and social sciences. We describe things, we use metaphors, we use rhetoric, we obliquely get at what something is. We don't expect to write the definitive biography of Napoleon that consists exclusively of true facts about Napoleon. Some interpretation is involved. You have to try to get at what that object Napoleon was. What were the really essential features of it? What were the accidental ones? And there will never be a final biography of Napoleon, whereas there might be a final understanding of the electron at some point. I like using this example from Daniel Dennett. Some of you may have heard this before, where he criticizes wine tasting. It's pretty funny. He either borrows or makes up this wine critic saying, a flamboyant and velvety Pinot, but lacking in stamina. Typical wine critic's statement. And he basically says, isn't that ridiculous? That's so pretentious. You know, what you really need to do is pour wine on the top of a machine, and it analyzes the chemistry, and it spits it out, and that's wine tasting. And of course, we need to do this too. You can do this. You can do a science of food. You can do a science of wine, and shed lights on what the chemical composition of a wine is. But we don't want to fire the wine taster at that point, do we? We want to give that wine taster some latitude to make these kind of statements that border on poetry and yet do have a cognitive value. There are better wine tasters and worse wine tasters. There are pretentious wine tasters. There are pretentious philosophers. There are pretentious art historians. There are pretentious architecture critics. You're not usually going to find a pretentious scientist. You're going to find maybe a boring scientist, a narrow-minded scientist, a dogmatic scientist, an unimaginative scientist. You're not going to find a pretentious physicist, really. Why? Because they speak in direct propositions about the worlds. It's hard to be pretentious if you're saying object X has properties A, B, and C. it's easier to be pretentious if you have to kind of go in a circle and obliquely get at what the thing is. And so I would say embrace the risk of pretension. Pretension is a risk run by the humanities. It's our occupational hazard. It is not something, we hopefully don't fall into it often, but it's something you risk falling into at every moment because of the way we have to talk. All right. All right. Now, here's why I chose the theme of black holes for this summer. I was giving a lecture in London in March, and the first question from the audience, which was a brutally honest question, and I loved it, was, what's the weakest point of your philosophy? And of course, there's weaselly ways to get out of this. You can say, oh, I just work too hard, or sometimes I'm so deep that nobody can understand. You know, those are not real, that's not what's asked for. What's asked for is a frank admission of what's the weakest point. And you know, some critics of object-oriented philosophy and speculative realism say we have no politics. That's not really true. I've got a political book coming out in October. You'll see there's stuff going on there. I would say the real weakness is that we are too Heideggerian on the question of knowledge. I like science a lot better than Heidegger did. I even like normal science in Kuhn's sense better than Heidegger did, but we still fall into this, at least I do, not the others, but I tend to fall into this trap of seeing science the way Heidegger does, that it can never really fully unveil the thing, and it's objectifying things in terms of present-at-hand qualities. And I'm less and less happy with that. I want to find a new way of looking at science that doesn't cave into dogmatic scientism, but that also doesn't just fail to appreciate what's going on there. Now, some people have already seen things like this. Kuhn, for example. Kuhn, who is often misread as saying paradigm shifts in science, which mean giant leaps forward in any given science as opposed to cumulative knowledge. He's often misread by people like Lakatos as saying this is mob rule. People just make a kind of religious conversion to a new paradigm and it's irrational, and therefore science becomes a question of who has the strongest group to beat up the other group. Kuhn never really says anything like that. Kuhn has some other problems, I think. He has too much an idea that there's always one ruling paradigm at any given moment when there's not. There's usually a conflict between several ruling paradigms. But Kuhn also drew this distinction between the paradigm, which is a big discontinuous thing, and normal science, which is where you're solving puzzles about the properties of a thing. There's anomalies, there's inconsistencies in a thing. You got to figure them out. So that's already a sort of object-oriented statement. I read paradigms as objects in my sense, not as sociological categories that change randomly every couple of centuries. A paradigm changes in science when the underlying object is replaced by a new object. That's how I interpret it. Well, it's also true that philosophia, in Socrates' sense, is not a knowledge. It's pretty clear from the Meno that no one really knows what virtue is, and therefore no one can teach it. Socrates is not trying to give us superior knowledge about virtue compared to what Meno has. If anything, the opposite. He's trying to show Meno he has no idea what virtue is. Yet there is a sort of knowledge, isn't there? We choose the best possible doctor to go to. We choose the best possible map of Switzerland when we come here to guide our hiking. Maps now are in some sense better than the ones that Anaximander made, which they're not bad for his time. So there is something like a knowledge, there is something like a progress. I wanted to ask myself, is there any way to incorporate this into philosophy, incorporate knowledge into philosophy, and not just the love of wisdom, and actually incorporate wisdom into philosophy, all while not claiming any absolute knowledge? And I have not reached a conclusion about this yet. I just have some thoughts about it. And of course, you could always say there's not, people claim to have knowledge in the sense of a correspondence with reality, right? This thing is an accurate picture of what's actually out there. I've tried to claim that's impossible because the best you can do is translate the reality. I've written positively about Latour's industrial model of truth, which is amusing. The industrial model is making a true statement about the world is kind of like taking crude oil in the geological seams of Saudi Arabia and through a series of steps making it gas you can put in your tank in France. No one would say that the gas in France resembles or corresponds to the oil underground in Saudi Arabia. It's a set of refinements and translations that have to go in there. All right, but there's still a problem there. This is a kind of overmining model of truth. It's a pragmatism. The true is what works. And that's not doing enough justice to science either. Science is doing a little more than saying we found theories that work. That's Feynman's interpretation of quantum theory. Shut up and calculate. Don't try to speculate about what quantum theory tells us about the world. And that's not satisfying. That's not what the really educated quantum theorists usually do, the really humanized ones, like Anton Seilinger, who I had the privilege to meet a couple years ago at Documenta. So really, there's just a problem here that runs throughout intellectual life, and it's the problem of reconciling the continuum with quanta, reconciling continuous things with things that jump. This goes all throughout all fields of knowledge. You find this in the wave-particle duality of light. You find this in, there's the continuum hypothesis in mathematics, which can either be proven or disproven. You have I think Aristotle's Physics and Metaphysics represents this paradox. What's the physics about? It's about continua. It's about the fact that time, number, space, motion cannot be broken into any number of discrete units. It's all one continuous thing, and it's arbitrary how we divide it up. How many pieces are there in this lecture room? Well, either 3 or 100 or 1,000,000 or 1,000,000,000,000. I can divide this room up any way I want. But how many people are there in this room? That's not arbitrary at all. There's an exact number of people. I can't say there's really just one person in this room and I'm arbitrarily carving you all into different things for my own practical purposes. That's because people are substances in the Aristotelian sense. And in a way, the physics is about continua, the metaphysics is about quanta. It's about substances. It's about things that cannot be arbitrarily smeared together. In some contemporary continental philosophies, there is the tendency to want to turn everything into a continuum and to say that we're arbitrarily cutting pieces out of it. And Bergson sometimes seems to say things like this. He sometimes seems to say the world is a continuum and we create objects by cutting them out for our own practical needs. But that's not entirely true of Bergson either. Remember that Bergson's first book, the brilliant Time and Free Will, we call it in English, or the essay on the immediate data of consciousness, says the opposite thing. He says there's not just a quantitative difference between a pinprick on my hand and a harder pinprick. There's a qualitative difference. There's different muscles are activated, different nerves are activated. And so that's a kind of discrete conception of pain, that each pain is different. It has different qualitative dimensions. It's not just that they're the same and one is harder than the other. So in a way, he starts his career on the other foot. And I don't know how you put those two together, actually, in Bergson. Now, I want to mention one other example that hits close to home for all of us in philosophy. It's often viewed as trivial. It's not. And that is the distinction between analytic and continental philosophy. It is very fashionable now, especially on the analytic side, to say that there is no real difference. It's superficial. It's merely sociological. There's just one philosophy, and we all need to work together. And of course, the dominant group will always say that, right? The minority group doesn't really exist. We're all a happy family. So it's not surprising that you're hearing this from the analytic side in Anglophone countries. However, I don't think it's a superficial distinction at all. I think there's a profound philosophical distinction at work here. I think there are two different conceptions of truth at work here. There's the cumulative conception of truth, Kuhn's normal science. What do analytic philosophers do? They define a series of problems. They make gradual progress on them. They move towards some resolution. How do continental philosophers see progress in philosophy? They see it in terms of paradigm shifts. They see it in terms of giant jumps forward with major thinkers that occur from time to time, a few times a century. And there are advantages and disadvantages to both. The disadvantage, I think, of analytic philosophy is that they do very ham-fisted, block-headed readings of the history of philosophy often. They'll say Plato has 25 arguments and 23 of them are unsound and could be crossed out. And that's not how to read Plato. Right? Plato is not a set of arguments. What's the disadvantage of our side, the continental side? It's that we can become very insecure because if you're not doing a paradigm-shifting work, what contribution do you have to make? Analytic philosophy is a little more democratic in that sense. You can always pick up a problem and add a little to it. And so there's a certain self-confidence there that you can refer to your friends from 2 years ago, and it's you don't have to just write reports about the greats, which is something we can fall into too easily in the continental side. Now, I want to say that also this was foreshadowed in the 1890s by Franz Brentano, maybe the last philosopher who was hard to place on either side of that divide. It's usually analytic philosophers who read him, but he's also Husserl's and Freud's teacher. Brentano gave this wonderfly acerbic lecture in Vienna that he probably insulted the whole audience in the 1890s, where he said, philosophy has two aspects. In one sense, it's like the natural sciences. Philosophy makes progress. On the other hand, philosophy is more like the fine arts. It has periods of ripeness, periods of decadence, and you can't say we're making progress any more than visual art makes progress. There's good periods, low periods, and so on. And the analytic philosophers who, like Brentano, stress the science part, of course. They forget that he ever said philosophy is also like a fine arts. What he's really saying there is that philosophy is about the split in half. It's about the split in one side that thinks truth is cumulative, the other side that thinks truth is a matter of jumps, paradigm shifts in Kuhn's sense, whereas the analytic philosophers think of it as normal science. You're making gradual progress. The analytic-continental divide is real, and it will not be solved until somebody figures out how to reconcile these two concepts of truth. I have no idea how to do it. Somebody might come up with a way to do this. That is when the divide will end and be replaced by something new. Now, in a sense, this same problem of the continuous and the discrete is very central for all of 20th century science, of course, because you've got the conflict between quantum theory and relativity, which also embody this difference. And Einstein is the person who biographically embodies this tension, because even though he's mostly remembered for telling Bohr that God doesn't play dice, he's not convinced by quantum theory, Einstein is also the one who came up with the quantum theory of light. After Planck came up with the quantum theory of heats, that heat doesn't just gradually rise, it jumps in small levels. You can only solve the black body problem that way by assuming that heat comes in little packets, by jumping up a little bit at a time. Einstein did this for light. Bohr did this for electron orbits, of course. That electrons can't just be anywhere around an atom. They have to be at orbit 1, orbit 2, orbit 3, and they jump suddenly, which violates special relativity. Why? Because Einstein showed us that nothing can go faster than the speed of light. So there's a problem with that. There's also a problem, and here we're getting to black holes, there's a problem with Newton's theory of gravity. Einstein realized this right away. If nothing can move faster than the speed of light, how does that square with Newton's claim that gravity is an instantaneous force that acts between all particles in the universe on each other with no delay whatsoever? Well, he realized this couldn't happen, and it took him about a decade to work out the solution, which we know today as the general theory of relativity, which interprets gravity as a curvature in space. And this is what Eddington, our old friend Eddington, helped verify in his observations of the eclipse by showing that starlight near the sun was bending. And it also follows as a consequence, as was discovered or theorized by a man named Karl Schwarzschild, who was a German fighting on the Russian front in the First World War, who died a few years later, that you can imagine in that case a curvature of space so great that nothing can escape. And they were calling it a singularity. It was not called a black hole until the 1960s, which was kind of the golden age of black holes. Einstein seems to have gone to his grave not believing this would really happen. But Brian Greene, who's the great popularizer of string theory and other physics, has a wonderful analogy to explain how this happens, which is that if you imagine that this tabletop is made of rubber, flexible rubber, and you put a bowling ball here, the bowling ball is going to make a big dent in the rubber, and there's going to be a dent around the bowling ball. Now take a marble, and imagine this is Earth, and roll it past the bowling ball. If you roll it just right, the marble is going to get caught in the dent, and it's going to roll around and around and around until it runs out of force. You can think of the Earth's orbit around the sun in this way, that the Earth is trying to go in a straight line. It can't. It's caught in the dent in space. It's caught in the bending of space. And of course, every object is creating a dent in space. It's not just the sun. The Earth is doing it. Now imagine that the bowling ball were extremely heavy or made of lead or something. It would just fall right down to the floor. And so if you roll anything past it, it's just going to fall right in. Never come out. Black hole. Now, there have been a number of arguments about this. Again, it was called a singularity until the 1960s. And the idea is that when the star collapses enough, the gravity is so massive that you have what's called an event horizon. When something gets past the event horizon, it can never get out. And that includes lights. It includes all information. And Hawking and Penrose, who we'll be talking about in class tomorrow, were two of the glamorous theorists of this in the 1960s until today. They're both still alive, of course. And it's also suspected that there are supermassive black holes at the core of every galaxy, and that the galaxies are orbiting around this giant black hole, and I guess eventually we'll all be sucked into it. Now, unlike most scientific objects, you can't see inside this. You can only either explain how they're formed, as far as we know, by the collapse of stars into supermassive points, or you can know them by their effects in the pragmatic way. You can look at what they do to other things. There's no verified black hole. There are candidates, because you can't see one. You can see a black hole, you can see a black part in space, and you can see things that you can see light that looks like it's going through a lens, but you can't know unequivocally that there's a black hole there. And so unlike most scientific objects, there is some illusion going on. There is some indirect deduction. You cannot definitively know what all the properties of black holes are, and this has been very clear in all the wild speculations that have gone on. We get some scientific realist critics, even within continental philosophy. Christopher Norris has been very harsh on this, for example. Christopher Norris says that speculative realism is okay insofar as we're realists, but the speculation part isn't so great, because we start saying all these weird things that science doesn't teach us about, like I say that objects don't touch, and Measu says that there's a God that's going to come in the future that isn't here, or may come in the future and resurrect the dead, and science doesn't support this, and therefore we should just stop the speculation and talk about things like inference from the best explanation and other kind of mainstream philosophy of science stuff. The problem with that is you need the speculation, and science has been doing this a lot more wildly than anybody in science, in philosophy. As I've mentioned, philosophy has gotten cold feet about speculating about the physical worlds. We've had a division of labor. The scientists can talk about the inanimate world. We talk only about human stuff. And I've already explained why that doesn't work, because they take our half away from us too. So we need to reassert our rights and start talking about the worlds, not to replace the sciences, but to give a parallel discourse on the worlds. And scientists sometimes don't even like this. there's that famous interview in Collapse, the journal, the Speculative Realist journal, where they're interviewing James Ladyman, who's just a hardcore scientistic philosopher who thinks that we should all shut up and listen to what the scientists tell us about time and space and matter. And Carlo Rovelli, a very eminent Italian physicist, says he's tired of this, right? Because we shouldn't be limping along trying to explain what the science has already done. We should try to leap ahead. We should try to come up with new concepts that the sciences might be able to use later. Einstein was inspired by Leibniz and Mach. Bohr was inspired by Kierkegaard. Philosophers now are afraid to talk about nature. They're afraid to speculate on what space and time are. They're afraid to speculate about the structure of objects. And Ladyman's answer to that, when he's read that quote, is that, well, of course, there are some philosophers who are capable of working at the cutting edge of science, but that wasn't the point. The point was working beyond the cutting edge of science. Not that we're better than scientists, but that who knows what uses physics is going to come up with for a philosophical theory 30 or 40 years from now. They can't even unify relativity and quantum theory. They can't explain dark matter and dark energy. Why are we intimidated by them out of talking about the world and confining ourselves to language or to human institutions and things of this sort? We should be going out there and doing it. And finally, scientists are giving some of the wildest speculations today. Lee Smolin, who's one of the most eminent physicists today, and a famous critic of string theory, which he calls too much of a dogmatic paradigm. Smolin's theory about black holes, at least when he wrote this book, I don't know if he still believes it, is that every black hole contains a baby universe. And that by Darwin's laws, it follows that universes that produce the most black holes produce the most offspring and are therefore the most successful, and therefore more baby universes will resemble those parent universes. And so over time, more universes will tend to have many more black holes, right? Because they'll inherit that characteristic from their parent universes. And Richard Dawkins loved this idea, being the strict Darwinist that he is, and he's asking around in some interviews, is this logical? And a lot of physicists are saying it's superfluous, we don't know, there's no evidence to prove it. That's one example. Another example of speculation connected with black holes is that there's a theory out there that a black hole is two-dimensional. It's not three-dimensional. And that this came from the result that it turns out that the surface area of a black hole is more important than its volume. So it might be that the black hole is actually two-dimensional, and it could follow from this that the universe itself is a hologram, that there is no real depth, that everything is holographically projecting a depth. Who knows if that's true or not? But if scientists themselves can speculate this wildly, why should I be limping along after the physics of 2014 and following, as Chris Norris recommends, what Gilbert Harman, not my relative, said about inference to the best explanation in the 1960s? There's no reason to do that at all. So I would say that science does have its aesthetic moments. I try to say that philosophy resembles aesthetics. Why? Because if knowledge is an attempt to replace an object by a list of properties, a known list of properties, the goal of philosophy is to drive a wedge between them. We see this already in Socrates. How can we know what properties virtue has unless we already know what virtue is? Wedge. Virtue is here, its properties are here. Virtue is something different from its properties. Philosophy, some people want to collapse a thing into its appearances and say there's nothing more than the appearances. I say we drive a wedge between those two. We create a tension between the object and its qualities. I think this is what philosophy is about. This is the research program of object-oriented philosophy. Thank you very much for listening.